Hey friends, it's Carrie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do a weekly wrap up of the 3 books I read this week. 2 of the 3 are nonfiction and it is Nonfiction November, so I would encourage you, if you don't typically read nonfiction, maybe try one. And I know I'm going to read quite a few JFK titles this month, so maybe I can encourage some of you out there, some of my booktube buddies out there, to read a JFK book. I don't know, I'm going to work on a couple of you and see if I can get somebody out there to read a JFK book with me. We'll see. The first book that I finished this week was The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore. And this is the story of dial painters in factories at the turn of the century who essentially were poisoned by the radium that was used in the undark paint. And of course the paint was called undark because it glowed in the dark. And these women were called the Shining Women because when they got off from work, it wasn't uncommon for them to glow in the dark because essentially they were covered head to toe in little particles, microscopic particles of radium. They would typically lip dip paint. So they would ensure that the paintbrush was nice and pointy for the detail work on the watches and on the airplane instruments that they were painting, by licking the paintbrush, because if they didn't do that, the bristles would get all spread out, and the water that they would use to try to even out the bristles, that would water down the radium paint. And so typically the factory owners didn't like for them to use water. They liked for them to use this lip pointing method. In 1898, when radium was discovered, when it was observed that it could treat cancer, a lot of people thought, well, if it can treat cancer, what else can it treat, right? It must be good for everything. And so some people put radium in water, they put it in makeup, and so factory owners and supervisors told the Radium Girls, the doll painters, that the little particles of radium in the paint wasn't enough to hurt them. It was just enough to make their cheeks rosy and to make them beautiful. And by 1927, about 50 or so of these women are dead. Now, initially, when some of the women started getting sick, they went to dentists because some of the initial symptoms were located within the jaw, because of course that's where they're ingesting the radium initially. So they were losing teeth, and the descriptions in the book are quite grotesque, and quite gruesome, which I think is intentional. The author doesn't include a lot of images or anything like that, but it is important that the stories are told and they are not glossed over, and that the pain and the suffering and the trauma that these women went through is exposed, because for a long time the factory owners and the lawyers and officials kind of tried to brush this under the rug or find other explanations for it. And in one case, they even tried to claim that the woman had syphilis and that these symptoms were a result of that. And her body ended up having to be exhumed to prove that that was not true, that this was indeed radium poisoning. Initially, they thought these women may have had falsy jaw, which was phosphorus necrosis, which was something that happened to the matchstick girls who worked in matchstick factories, where they had to deal with large vats of phosphorus. And when they would inhale this phosphorus, that would cause the bone death in the jaw. So initially they thought maybe there's phosphorus in this paint. But of course, that wasn't the case. So it was a little bit of a mystery, but eventually we find out, no, that radium, once it enters the body treats it kind of like calcium. It doesn't recognize it, and so it stores it in the bones. And so some of these women, only have problems in the jaw. Some of these women have problems in their spine. Some of these women have problems in their knees, some in the hip, some in their feet. And so the symptoms kind of ran the gambit of, all sorts of joint issues and, osteonecrosis sort of issues. So very descriptive. This book follows so many different women that it's a little bit hard to keep up. But I think the author's intention is to give a face to these women, which I think she does, show you a little bit of their personality. I think most of what was out there maybe before was only like court documents and court testimonies and that sort of thing. So I think she was trying to find a balance, which is, what good nonfiction should do. I think she was trying to find a good balance. Unfortunately, because there's so many women, you may get a little lost with that, but it is extremely well researched, extremely well documented, and it's a story that deserves to be told. And eventually, it is a long road, but eventually these girls do win a court case, and that court case does provide occupational protections that end up with OSHA protections for workers, and also protections for some of our scientists who work on the Manhattan Project. So when you think about, in later years, all of the scientific research that's done with nuclear energy and, atomic power, those people would not be protected if not for factory workers painting watch dials with radium. So pretty neat. The second book that I read this week was The Wives by Tarryn Fisher, and this is a psychological thriller. This was recommended by Books Yada Yada, and I had a similar feeling when I finished this book to the feeling I had when I finished Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. And I don't know if I loved it or if I hated it. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm kind of like oscillating between 2 stars and 4 stars for this book. I kind of go back and forth. I will say that I finished this book very quickly. So it was a book that I was very eager to read when I would come home every day, and it was very fast paced. We follow a character named Thursday, who is married to her husband Seth, who is a polygamist. He has 2 other wives. And confession, for a little while I didn't realize Thursday was her name. I thought Thursday was the day of the week that her husband came to see her. But so she doesn't know anything about these 2 other wives. And through a series of events, she starts discovering some more information about these wives that leads her to believe that her husband is not as perfect as she thinks he is. And maybe she shouldn't be so accepting of this polygamist lifestyle. And so she starts doing a little Facebook stalking on these other women, and then she starts doing some actual stalking. And I can't tell you anything else about this book without ruining it. However, I will say that when I finished the book, my mind was blown. I was a little bit taken aback because I keep going back and forth between thinking this was great or this was cliche and this was a cop-out and this ending is just a way of not having to explain a lot of different things in the book. I don't know. You'll have to read it in order to talk to me about this book because I don't want to ruin it for you. It's one of those books you just have to read. So, The Wives by Tarryn Fisher. It's worth a read because, again, I'm still going back and forth. I don't know if I love it or if I hate it. So I don't even have a Goodreads review on it because I just didn't know what to say. The third book I read this week was Kennedy's Last Days by Bill O'Reilly. This was actually a gift from a student a few years ago, and so I just picked it up just this week and started looking at it. It's actually written for young adults. So this is like a young adult adaptation of his book, Killing Kennedy. So, of course, a lot of the really juicy nuggets that are in Killing Kennedy are not in this book because it's adapted for the younger reader. So if you're looking for any major insights or interesting new information, it's not in this book. However, if you know absolutely nothing about the Kennedy assassination, or if you're a younger reader, then this is an excellent book because it gives you a step-by-step breakdown. It's very succinct. It's very nicely organized. It has a lot of pictures. It has a lot of kind of nicely placed quotes throughout, and it's got a nicely done timeline. If you have a middle or high school student who is interested in this topic, maybe pick this up for them. So it was a nice gift from a student. Definitely something that I'll keep in the library for those students who are interested. So it doesn't really focus on Kennedy's last days. It takes you through his entire presidency. You don't really get to the assassination part till maybe the last 25% of this book. So it doesn't really focus on that. Currently reading Dead Wake by Eric Larson, which is about the sinking of the Lusitania, and I am almost done with that, and that is really awesome. I'm loving that. So that will probably be in next week's wrap up unless I do a separate video on that one book. I will link an article in the description box about the Radium Girls if you're interested in checking that out. And thanks for joining me, guys. If you haven't done so, please hit that subscribe button. I appreciate you sticking around, and I will see you next time. Have a great night.